Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the historian and author Kate Williams and the PR consultant Alex Deane. So hello to both of you.
Hello.
So let's see then what's on some of those front pages. And as you might expect, Theresa May's Florence speech dominates. The Telegraph says Brexit has been put on hold for another 4 years, angering Eurosceptics. The Mail says Theresa May has temporarily put the brakes on Brexit to give the government more time to negotiate with Brussels. The Guardian also leads with the Prime Minister's proposal for a 2-year transition period. The newspaper says the speech has been welcomed by European leaders and by the Cabinet. While the FT says it was a conciliatory speech which has been well received by Brussels. The Times focuses on the Brexit bill, saying Mrs May has agreed to pay £40 billion in return for a transition deal. The Express reports that Nigel Farage has reacted angrily to the speech, accusing Theresa May of insulting those who voted for Brexit. And The Sun's gone with a different story. They're leading with the court appearance of the 18-year-old charged over the Parsons Green tube attack. And the Mirror also leads with that story, saying the suspect is accused of buying bomb ingredients online. So let's get our teeth into some of those stories with Kate Williams and Alex Deane. And Theresa May is the main story in town. On a lot of the front pages, as we saw just there, you picked out the Daily Telegraph to kick off with, but it really is a similar headline on all of them. And the main point of the speech, the papers at least are picking out, is this transition period of 2 years confirmed by her today. Around 2 years were her words.
Yes, around 2 years, because obviously it is quite a short period of time that we now have if it was going to be a super fast cliff-edge Brexit to get everything done, since it pretty much has to be completed by this time next year, so it can all be ratified by the following March. So the two main points that came out of the speech were essentially that we are going to be having this 2-year transition period, and during that transition period, Mrs May said the country is going to pay in to the EU, pay into the budget, and essentially she made this very clear speech that we're going to pay in what we owe. But John Major said very clearly, he said, we need to have more charm, we need to have less sabre-rattling. And we did see more charm here, more attempts to work together, less sabre-rattling. But Michel Barnier has already said we need more specifics, and one concern of his is, and Guy Verhofstadt said the same, is that of the Irish citizens. And although Mrs May said in the speech very clearly they don't want any infrastructure on the Irish border, she didn't give any specifics about how this will be. So hopefully that's going to follow, because that's a big question.
So lots of different points there. The for example, also saying no real Brexit until 2021. So. Even though we did hear Michel Barnier using words like constructive, there are going to be some that aren't happy about the idea that we're effectively in the same situation as we are now, i.e. effectively inside the EU for another 4 years.
And of course we saw stronger comments from some people saying that it was offensive to people who voted to leave. I mean, I led one of the Brexit campaigns and I don't feel insulted one bit. The important thing for me is that we leave the European Union. And this is part and parcel of the realistic and pragmatic process of doing just that. And on the thing that's across all of the papers, with alarming specificity in each example, totally different, and I made a note to myself of what they were. The Telegraph said this is going to cost us £9 billion a year. The Express, if the 2-year transition period is right, is sort of on song with them at £18 billion. Then the FT says €20 billion total, and the Times says £40 billion total. Totally different figures. If you only read one of these newspapers, you'd think it was gospel. The reality is they haven't got a Scooby what we're going to wind up paying if we do pay anything. Remember, of course, another legitimate interpretation is that the negotiations take place despite all of the goodwill that's been involved. We don't get the kind of deal we want, and we leave and trade on WTO terms. Contrary to the Prime Minister's wishes, we may leave not paying anything. But these newspapers are saying they know for sure what we're going to be contributing to the European Union in 2021.
OK.
Totally false.
I'll come back.
The exchange rate, because we're going to be contributing in euros. So one question is how much these euros are going to cost us, and that could account for some of the huge discrepancy there. Because
not that sort of discrepancy, but that's a fair point. There's been a spike in the euro in recent days, but of course the pound is back up near where it was when the Brexit vote happened.
And on that note, I do want to bring in a line that has developed this evening. We've heard from the ratings agency Moody's. They're saying that they're downgrading Britain's credit rating by a further notch. And they have said that Brexit uncertainty is a factor in that decision. They're saying the government's plans to fix the public finances have been knocked off course and Brexit could weigh on the economy. So it's now 2 notches off its top rating.
AAA is top, AA plus, AA1 was where we were, and we're now at AA2. Look, these agencies are entitled to their views, and they're paid good money to make analysis, but in the end, they're making a hypothetical judgment on where they think markets are. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. I think the wrong reaction to them is to get hysterical about it. So when France was downgraded by Standard & Poor's to A, as I recall, the French went bananas and said these agencies should stop interfering with the way that markets work, and now they're not allowed to grade euro bonds anymore because it's judged to be an interference in the market. I'm not for that. I'm all for free speech, and that free speech extends to these agencies. However, it seems a strange time to make a decision like this when the Prime Minister, even if you're critical of the speech, has given us much more certainty than you might have expected. She said, we're going to come out of the single market, which in my view, of course, is good, and others disagree. We're going to come out of the customs union. We will leave on the 29th of March 2019, and we will have a transition period. Now, at this still opening stage of negotiations, you can't get much more specific than that.
Or do we have still a lot of questions about what happens after the transition?
I think there are a huge amount of questions, considering we have pretty much had over a year since the Brexit vote. This is a speech that should have been made long ago and given us some kind of certainty, given the EU certainty, indeed giving the EU citizens in Britain some kind of certainty. This is way overdue, and that's the problem, that essentially we have this speech and we now see some level of government policy, but literally we've only got a year to get it organised, and that is why there's uncertainty, because the government has been... we all know that David Cameron made no plans to leave the EU. The government has been scrambling to catch up. I'm afraid I feel there was far too long a summer holiday for all of these, for particularly Mrs May, many ministers, and we are way behind, and that's the uncertainty, that after this period, this transition period, then what happens? That's what we don't know. And
I don't disagree with all of that. Of course, you're right that it was outrageous of the government in a binary vote not to make plans for one of the two options. And I think you're right too that this is not a speech full of specificity. But the point is that specificity is for negotiating teams who are head-to-head in hopefully a bit more private setting where they can thrash things out rather than a set-piece speech. The point of this speech was to deliver the positivity and the optimism that we started on, and she did do that.
And break the deadlock with negotiations to allow them to move on to the next stage.
Right.
Do you think enough's been done on that?
I absolutely do. The Council will decide on the 19th and 20th of October whether or not, in their terms, sufficient progress has been made to allow negotiations to take place both on the bill and the arrangement for leaving and on the ongoing relationship. I think this speech lays a really solid platform for allowing us to do that.
And in pretty much a word, do you agree with that?
No, because we need more...
So you bet they'll say no?
Who will say no?
The European Council.
What I'm saying is, yes, the speech was useful. Yes, the speech has laid out things very clearly. Yes, we finally broken that deadlock, about which is a lot of it was about money and also about protecting the rights of EU citizens. But that is way overdue. It should have been done a long time ago.
But has enough been done to move on to the next stage and the more substantive, some would say, talks over the future trade relationship?
I think we are now accepting the reality, which before David Davis said, we can immediately make trade deals, we can do it in a minute, we can all do them side by side. Now we're accepting it sequential. Yes, hopefully we are now moving forward.
Do you think that the Council's going to say we can do twin-track negotiations or not?
I don't think they're going to say we're going to do twin tracks. They're going to say we need more. They're going to say more about the border, more specifics on the Irish border, more specifics on the EU citizens.
Which is pretty much what President Macron has said tonight. OK, let's move on to another big story that has got people talking, certainly in London anyway, and that is the decision by Transport for London, the regulator, over Uber, saying that it should lose its licence in London.
I think this is a great shame for choice for consumers. Millions of Londoners use this service and other services like it every day. I'm one of them. Before the black cab tsunami overwhelms me on Twitter, I also use black cabs a lot too. But it's obvious to me in the end, this isn't about safety, nor indeed is it about the tax questions for which Uber is frequently lampooned, something that's wholly outside TfL's remit. This is about lobbying. Uber in the end got out-lobbied by a monopolistic cartel of black cab drivers. And well done them. If that's what you want to have, it's a victory for the Luddites. And I think it substantially sets back the sharing economy and gig economy, of which Uber is a significant example.
I think what it has to be remembered is this is a decision that's been made. It's lost its licence. The reasons were given were not keeping up with regulation about criminal offences, about medical documents. But of course, Uber will appeal this, and throughout the appeal period, they'll be acting as they normally do. And it may be that after the appeal period, if they fit in with what TfL is asking for, they can continue. And so as you say, I love black cabs too, but I genuinely use public transport because otherwise I'd get no exercise if I didn't walk to the top of the bus. But
Uber is a lot cheaper, and that's a relevant point.
But essentially, if it wasn't Uber, it's going to be someone else, because someone else will make something called Suber or something else, because people are now used to using their phones, using their smartphones, and that's the problem. Black cabs are amazing, they're iconic, there's nothing more fantastic than when you're lost to see one going past you. But I think the next question, of course, for taxis is robot drivers, and that's going to undermine everyone, all of the gig economy. But there is a thing to remember, that there are 40,000 drivers here that we have to remember, because Uber are going to appeal, are not immediately going to lose their jobs.
But their jobs are now in question. Some of the lobbying in this situation has been ridiculous. The LTDA, which represents the black cabs, they wanted there to be a 5-minute break between you requesting an Uber and getting it, so that a black cab might pick you up in between. That's like saying the lights in the studio shouldn't come on for 5 minutes to give candle makers a chance. I mean, some of their positioning has just been crazy, but in the end, they've lobbied consistently and well enough, and they have, at least temporarily, succeeded. But Sadiq Khan is playing... Totally separate point.
The TfL is being... It's not about lobbying, it's about the fact that they don't feel that they're keeping to the criminal offences
question. Of course not. They wouldn't have renewed Uber's licence 4 months ago if it was about that.
OK, we must go to a break.
All right.
Thank you. Although you did give me the lovely image of a candelabra on set.
We'll have it for part 2.
We must take a break, though. We can return to this at 11:30. We've got lots more to talk about after the break as well, including a Far From a Sweet Deal, the tale of shrinking Haribo. It's coming up. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Kate Williams and Alex Deane. And we're going to turn our attention to the German elections coming up this weekend, of course. And this is inside the Times. It's slightly cropped there. I'll see if I can get a better version of you for you in a moment. But this is a big moment, even though Angela Merkel is the favourite to win.
The headline we're missing is "Rise of Hard Right Taints Merkel's Cruise to Victory," and that looks to be right. The Alternative for Deutschland, which some viewers may be confused by because it used to represent a whole different set of values, and the party sort of morphed and got taken over by people on the right of politics and dragged to a different position, looks set to get as much as 1 in 10 seats in the Bundestag. That, along with other results, will be significant enough that whilst Angela Merkel does win the election, she won't win outright and she'll have to go into coalition. That was pretty much expected, but of course coalition negotiations can take months. So it won't be the only negotiation in Europe. And the other thing I think is worth saying is, yes, of course, we in the UK are fascinated by this Brexit process, but I think historians, when they look back, will think Germany's election, returning Frau Merkel, and if she completes this, she'll have been in post longer than anyone apart from Bismarck. Leading Germany, will probably think that election's more important than the speech we've just been hearing.
And so it's been very interesting to follow the Germany debates, in which Brexit is never mentioned. They have many debates when you follow the German election debates about foreign policy, about home policy, about domestic issues, but Brexit is not mentioned. It shows that obviously it's the big issue for Britain, but for them it's much smaller. But certainly Mrs. Merkel is very popular in Germany. She's presided over Germany, a huge economic increase in Germany, and even despite the rise of the hard right, which we're seeing across Europe, and we expected to have a much greater share of the vote given in Holland to the far right hard right. They failed. We were concerned about what was going to happen in France. President Macron won. We will see certainly Mrs. Merkel win, but let's see whether they get as many seats as we're predicting, because it's very unclear exactly how many they are going to get. One in is very high.
These movements underpoll because people aren't willing to admit that they were going to vote for them.
Or people do change their minds at the ballot box. There's nothing. What we know, certainly what we've learned in the last couple of years, is that polls cannot be trusted. So let's see.
So true. That election happening on Sunday, of course, and this is another story that you wanted to talk about here, about the ongoing spat between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, which gets increasingly frightening.
Well, they're calling each other names. I'm not sure it gets more frightening.
Well, hasn't Kim Jong-un now threatened to test.
And there was the bomb over
hydrogen
Japan quite recently.
Twice. Yes, the consistent position of the North Korean government has been that they wish to acquire nuclear weapons so as to defend themselves. And if you were part of an ostracised regime which saw in turn Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein toppled from power and then executed, you would rather have the distinguishing feature that made people more afraid to seek to topple your regime too. So their position, whilst obviously appalling, is not irrational. They treat their citizens like dirt. They are not going to win a popular election to stay in power in North Korea. If you want to, you have to build an arsenal. Now, President Trump is saying the same kinds of things that President Obama said about the capacity to destroy North Korea and its regime. He's also saying it in his own unique style.
Well, yes, but is that helpful given the sensitivity of the situation?
Well, I think a key word that Alex used there is ostracised, and North Korea is ostracised. They're treated in a very ostracised sense, and the crisis in North Korea has increased exponentially since President Trump has come to power. And it is what President Trump is clearly playing very well to the home audience when he rattles his sabres against North Korea. But it has to be said that the home audience in North Korea, they too are treated like dirt, they are starving, but they feel that America is out to get them.
Hang on, but what you've just said isn't true. North Korea has been on a consistent path to where it is now for decades, not weeks or months, but for decades.
I'm not saying...
Then they've always been told, people of North Korea have always been told the Americans, the great Satans, are about to kill them. So literally nothing has changed in North Korea.
I know.
They've just got a bit stronger. So to suggest it's exponentially worse.
But it has got so much worse because the crisis itself has got... There wasn't this missile... We had a missile testing just the other week. Things have changed exponentially.
Yes, they're getting better, but that's not to do with President Trump's position. They're getting technologically better.
President Trump saying fire and fury does not help. But essentially what Trump wants, he does not want to get involved in a war. What he's trying to do with all this shouting and screaming is to try and encourage China to ostracise North Korea, to cut off their supply of gas. And whether China's going to do that, that's the question. But Trump doesn't want to do it himself. He just wants to make a fuss and get someone else to do the dirty work.
Well, we are actually out of time. We did promise we'd talk about sweets, which I know is a strange leap from talking about
but it's important,
nuclear wars.
If only for a brilliant headline, Fizzy Rascals, and of Haribo making their packets smaller, Harry Carry in the corner as the packet sizes are diminished. It's the spectre of a sugar tax, which we must all fight.
Or inflation. What about post-Brexit inflation?
Post-Brexit
inflation too.
OK, at 11:30. But for the moment, both of you, thanks so much. Hello there, you're watching Sky News and the Press Preview. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the historian and author Kate Williams and the PR consultant Alex Deane. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And as you might expect, Theresa May's Florence speech dominates. The Telegraph says that Brexit has been put on hold for another 4 years, angering Eurosceptics. The Mail says Theresa May has temporarily put the brakes on Brexit to give the government more time to negotiate with Brussels. The Guardian also leads with the Prime Minister's proposal for a 2-year transition period. The I newspaper says the speech has been welcomed by European leaders and by the Cabinet, while the FT says it was a conciliatory speech which has been well received by Brussels. The Times focuses on the Brexit bill, saying Mrs May has agreed to pay up to £40 billion in return for a transition deal. The Express reports that Nigel Farage has reacted angrily to the speech, accusing Theresa May of insulting those who voted for Brexit. The Sun's gone with a different story. They're leading with the court appearance of the 18-year-old charged over the Parsons Green tube attack. And the Mirror also leads with that story, saying the suspect is accused of buying bomb ingredients online. So let's talk through the front pages and stories inside as well with Kate Williams and Alex Deane. But really, we have to kick off, don't we, with Theresa May's speech, because really most of the papers lead with it. You've picked out The Guardian to kick off with, but it's a similar headline on all of them, highlighting the fact that Theresa May has talked about this around 2 years, she said, transition period.
Well, what the Prime Minister sought to do in this speech is she talked about people who find this a time of excitement and great promise for the future, and those for whom this is a worrying time. And those are both reasonable positions for people to have in our current situation. And this was a heartfelt attempt to speak to both groups in this country. And I think that was just the right note for her to strike, speaking to us as an audience. But I think, furthermore, it was the right thing to do in the context of these negotiations. Next month, there's going to be a decision taken by the European Council. Have we made sufficient progress in the negotiations to let us progress to twin-track negotiations? Both what is the nature of our departure and the arrangement for that, and what is the future relationship like? It's an important decision, and I think this speech should be seen through the lens of that. This was an attempt to offer a note of positivity and encouragement to the Europeans to let us get on with these negotiations the way they should be, discussing both things at once, which formally, right now, we can't do.
And just to pick up on that very quickly, sorry, Kay, but has she made enough progress with this speech, given the fact that, although Michel Barnier afterwards called it constructive, the French president has said that those three areas that the EU wanted progress on, Northern Ireland, EU citizens' rights, and the Brexit bill, he suggested that not enough progress had been made.
Yeah, I think we absolutely have made enough progress, and I think you get into the weeds of it, and if you look at the round after round of the negotiations we've had, there's a lot of positivity from David Davis's team and the Barnier team they face. The weird thing is that these are initial posturing phases in which some people were always going to say, oh, well, that's all correct and that's all terrible. The weird thing is in this country, uniquely, as far as I can ever think about, we've got some people who want to say everything the European Union says is absolutely correct, and our own government is always wrong. This sort of perverse, self-lacerating position. And that extends to reacting to, oh, well, Macron must be right, rather than our Prime Minister, who I thought gave a good speech today.
Do you think it was a good speech, Kate?
I think it was a speech which we have long awaited. We needed some kind of relationship with the EU which was not sabre-rattling, which was not saying we'll do this, which was not saying, oh, we'll get trade deals in a minute, like David Davis said. We'll be doing trade deals at the same time as debating the bill and the EU citizens. He said that.
We can also do that.
Well, he said that all along, and now
but
finally...
We still can do that.
Well, it depends whether they think we've made enough progress on questions about the money, on questions about EU citizens, on questions about the Northern Irish border. Although, in the speech, Mrs May said, we don't want any infrastructure on the Irish border. We already had Guy Verhofstadt tweeting saying, we need more clarity on this, because that is a big question for the EU, about Ireland, about citizens, about the money, and those things to them need to be sorted out. And if only this kind of speech, this kind of decisions, this kind of policy had been produced this time last year, because we voted to leave and voted to have the Brexit vote over a year and a half ago, and only now, when we have pretty much a year before October 2019 things have to be ratified, are we creating some kind of policy. It is late, it is rushed, it is last minute, and I think this is a good start. I think we are now, Mrs May, the Cabinet, and I think to an extent the British people are accepting the reality that you can't just leave. It's very, very complex ties up, very complex links, legal links and trade links, and you have this transition period is particularly engaging for business. Business are the ones who are really concerned about this. They're concerned about the money, they're concerned about pound, they're concerned about EU workers, and this does give them 2 years at least of some kind of certainty.
But there will be some that won't like the idea of another 2 years where we're effectively still in the EU, we're still in the single market and still in the customs union. There's a suggestion that some will feel shortchanged who voted for leave.
Well, I voted for leave and I participated as much as I could in the campaign to leave. I don't feel shortchanged. On the other hand, I think that it's important that we think about what this means in clarity terms. The Prime Minister said we will leave the single market and we will leave the customs union. That was a core part of her speech today, and that should be meat and drink to those like me who want us to leave the European Union. We're talking about a transition agreement. It's not just staying in the EU. It's something that provides certainty to business and lets us get out in a structured, orderly way. The debate we've been having has been Remainers saying, oh, we can't have a cliff edge for ages. And then when the Prime Minister gives a speech about ensuring we have an orderly exit with the transition, they point to that too and say, well, how can you justify this? You're just staying in the EU. Really, this is the pragmatic and sensible position taken by our Prime Minister. And let's think about this. She didn't want us to leave in the first place. She voted to remain. She has managed to reconcile herself to the democratic will of our country and is seeking to implement that decision. I think most people should rally around her now.
But I think one big question here until 2021 is the next election. We are going to have another election before
2022.
Well, is that really going to be the case?
That's what the Fixed Term Parliament Act says. You may know better. But...
Well, I'm not. Of course, there is a fixed term parliament, but there has been this snap election called before that. The question of whether or not Mrs May is going to continue the majority until 2021, if Mr Corbyn, who obviously won a lot of seats off her previously, the political question here also is whether or not we're going to stay in the EU, whether or not there is going to be an election that could impact quite heavily on this decision of leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, particularly when it comes to Labour Party policy.
That's a really interesting question. question.
Yep.
No Tory could pretend that having called an election we didn't have to call and then lose 33 seats, we'd had a good result. But one good thing that does come out of the 2017 election is that it gives you a whole 5 years to get beyond a transition period before we have to go to the next general election. That's a good outcome.
OK, let's rush on. There's another story that features on some of the front pages, but you've picked out the Sun's coverage. I think it's because of the headline, isn't it?
Headline's great. Cab catastrophe. Uber has had their licence suspended in London. 3.5 million registered users will not be able to use the app as soon as this decision is implemented. Now, it is the end of the month, is the formal deadline, but as these stories report, Uber will have the ability to appeal, and they no doubt will.
And that could take months.
And that could take some time.
It will continue working as it is.
It will continue to work until it doesn't continue to work. But I think one thing that I want to think about on top of the story of whether this app works or not for people getting around the capital is the political connotations. Because our mayor, Sadiq Khan, has really aligned himself with the Black Cab campaign, if I can call it that, which is what, basically trying to squeeze out their rival in a protectionist move and get Uber banned. And it's been very popular among a certain unionist and traditional left type of voice in the media and in Twitter and so forth. But I think he's playing with fire.
Don't you think that TfL is correct? And surely that they are correctly saying that essentially what they're saying, I'm not... What they're saying is that Uber simply hadn't corresponded with medical certificates, with criminal offence certificates. I mean, they wouldn't just conjure this out of nowhere.
If that were really the case, then they wouldn't have renewed Uber's licence this year. I mean, 3 or 4 months ago. This is a case.
They did say they were going to look into it further, and they extended it for a period of time.
And then give them what? So they gave them 1 minute's notice they were announcing it, and then it's going to be the end of the month that you lose your licence. And it's no reasonable regulator behaves like that. This is about lobbying and politics. This isn't about safety. And anyone who thinks it's anything other than protectionism and trying to protect a monopoly, I think, has got it very wrong.
The thing is, I love black cabs. I do use them, as I was saying earlier, because I love public transport, because otherwise I'd never get any exercise unless I didn't walk up and down an escalator. But there is the problem here that black cabs, I know many of them I've spoken to said they voted to leave to try and get rid of Uber. The thing is that if it wasn't for Uber, it'll be something else. Unfortunately, the gig economy is now here to stay. Airbnb is here to stay. Even people want to crack down on that. Oh. If it wasn't Uber, someone else will come in and call it super. So even if Uber loses its licence, and obviously there are 40,000 drivers out there who depend on Uber for their livelihoods, even if Uber loses its licence, someone else will come in. And increasingly, we will have robot-driven cars, which will completely change everything.
I agree with you that someone else will fill the gap. Where I don't agree with your word unfortunate about the gig economy. Millions of people get more choice as a result of these things, not just we as consumers who get cheaper cabs and more flexibility on what we choose.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying unfortunate for us. I was saying that black cab drivers are seen as unfortunate. I wasn't saying myself I thought it was unfortunate. I use Airbnb all the time. I think they're great.
It's a great way to make money, and it's a great way for some people to work.
And the black cab drivers would say, we're not being protectionist, we just want the competitors to play by the same rules as we do. That's what they would say. We've only got about a minute, but let's very quickly just touch on the general elections, which are coming up this weekend. If it wasn't for Brexit speeches and Uber decisions, we might be focusing a little bit more on them, of course.
It's probably still the most important thing happening this weekend, and it looks like Angela Merkel will be returned to office, but not with enough of a vote to govern on her own. That's par for the course in Germany. She'll have to form a coalition, but the nature and context of that coalition will be subject to the votes that they get. It looks like as many as 1 in 10 seats will be won by the Alternative for Deutschland, the party on the right that's anti-migration and wants to restore hard borders to Germany. That will make forming a coalition more difficult, and it will certainly make Angela Merkel's position in this remarkable run of becoming Germany's second longest ever chancellor, if she sees out her next term, less secure than she might have liked.
Well, we don't know yet what's going to happen. We were told that Holland was going to be taken over by the far right. It didn't happen. There was concerns about the French election. Didn't happen. Let's see what does actually happen in Germany. But certainly it is very interesting, I think, to study how popular Mrs. Merkel is, how much she has secured German popularity in Germany, a lot of it due to how Germany has become an economic powerhouse, much more so under her. And simply... one of the big questions in Germany, a lot of the Germans I speak to, is who is going to replace her? There is no one they can think of coming up the ranks who can replace her. Many people I think she thinks she's been in the job for quite a long time, but there is no one as her successor.
She's more popular now than she was when she was first elected.
Extraordinary. OK, and that on Sunday, of course, we'll have full coverage here. We are going to take a break. Lots more coming up, including the papers turn their attention to Strictly, and we'll do the same in just a moment. Welcome back to the press preview. We're taking a look at the morning papers with Kate Williams and Alex Deane. And we're going to talk about the latest spat between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. This is inside the Times.
Yes. They seek to outdo each other with the worst names they can call one another, sometimes rococo words like dotard, which I'm sure had several people reaching for their dictionaries.
Google.
Oh, yes, all Googled. Kim Jong-il dismissed Donald Trump as a gangster, which I think is an insult in some countries and a compliment in others, but nevertheless, I'm pretty sure he meant it negatively. It's because the North Koreans have consistently sought to develop nuclear capability and are increasingly close to that. Not only are they able now to, as we've seen, fire over Japan, but the long-held belief by many people that they couldn't miniaturise their nuclear capacity onto the warheads they have seems also to have been overcome. So what holds them back, it seems, is rationality, is the desire not to be destroyed themselves. And this is not a regime that is wholly rational.
And what do you make of this name-calling, Kate? Do you think it's childish or worrying?
I think both of them are playing to their home audiences. I think Trump is very much playing to a home audience who enjoys this kind of chain-rattling, sabre-rattling, who still likes to imagine that America can go in and sort everything out and still sees to an extent Korea as unfinished business after the Korean War. And Kim Jong-un is doing the same. There is a population of people there who have been very isolated, very far isolated from trade, from travel, and to them they feel that the American people and the government, to an extent the West, are out to get them. And so both of them are playing to the home audience, and that's very short-sighted. They're not thinking of the big picture, the big diplomatic picture. And in a sense, what we've seen over and over again is that wars, sabre-rattling, threats do not work. What works is trying to create some kind of collaboration. And essentially, Trump likes to play tough, but whether or not he does not want to get the American army into this kind of war. What he wants from all this sabre-rattling, from all this tweeting, fire and fury tweeting, he wants China to cut off the gas supply to Korea. He wants China to take action because he's not going to do it himself. But whether or not they'll be pressured into doing that, that's the question.
That realpolitik final point Kate makes about China being involved is absolutely true. And that's the way that American foreign policy has often worked with triangulation. This is actually, in some ways, a classic play. Just as Nixon pounded the table and said he would destroy the communists while Kissinger was out negotiating with them secretly, many in Trump's regime are having far more reasoned conversations with the Koreans and others to seek to negotiate a solution. So whilst many don't like Donald Trump and may just see this as another aspect of his character they don't like, you can rationalise his outbursts as part of a legitimate strategy. But the mistake that people will make in looking at these two large men saying nasty things to each other, is to think of them as morally equivalent. One, whilst we may not like him, is the legitimately elected head of a large democracy, which has all the liberal values and rule of law that we have and cherish ourselves. And the other is a dictator, third generation, who systematically represses his people, who kills people with anti-aircraft guns, who starves them, makes them eat grass. I mean, there is no moral equivalence between these two people, and we shouldn't make that mistake just because they're saying things we don't like to hear.
OK.
Well, there is no moral equivalence, but what we have to fear is that sanctions on North Korea are going to hurt those people who eat grass even more, that creating trade sanctions, because there is some opening up, there is some tourism, getting rid of that is going to make those people suffer even more, and he is going to actually play into the hands of Kim Jong-un, who's going to play even more hardcore with that. Okay. And of course, the big problem of North Korea is how close it is to Korea, how close it is to Japan, how close it is to China, and so many hugely populated countries.
With warnings of testing a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific as well, which is the focus there. Let's move on very briefly, see if we can squeeze in two very different, changing the subject drastically, very different stories. You've picked out a picture of these models.
Well, sorry.
No, after you, please.
It's quite an interesting story because it's Milan Fashion Week. It's the time for Fashion Week, one of our biggest industries across the world. And they got the old 90s supermodels together, all facing 50 for the Versace show. And I think these women really show how much modelling and fashion and sales have changed. In those days, they could say, we don't get out of bed for less than £15,000. They were the catwalk queens. But now it's all about social media. It's all about social media influencers. The people who are on the catwalks, sometimes people who are social media queens. We have a completely different way of selling, of fashion and of modelling. And the world has changed.
I wonder if people aren't stars in the same way now that they were when these women came to the fore. Of course, on one view, it's just, isn't it what wonderful that women can be objectified at any age, not just when they're young? How lovely. But on the other hand, maybe it's a bit like Grand Slam tennis, where you have one generation who's just so much better than the ones who come after them, that they remain dominant in their field a full generation afterwards. Is that what these women are? I don't know.
OK, and very briefly, we must touch on Strictly, because Charlotte Hawkins, formerly of this parish...
Sky alumni, yeah.
Exactly.
We are encouraged towards neutrality in many environments. I abandon that,
Yep.
and I declare that I want Charlotte to win.
Charlotte to win, and I think my bet for the final is Charlotte to win and Reverend Coles also in the final, so I can't wait. So obviously Charlotte's going to be a fantastic dancer, and I can't wait to see Reverend Coles also dancing.
If you have to watch
in
another
his
channel,
cassock.
watch that.
OK, go Charlotte.
Go Charlotte.
On that note, we must leave it there. Alex and Kate, always good to see you.
Thank you.